So we're going to do I Have a Bird in Spring in this lesson. This one, I'm going to just start with the context, I think, because I think it's really important to sort of understand where does it come from. So it's a poem that is about Susan Dickinson, who is Dickinson's sister-in-law. She wasn't originally called Dickinson. She married into the family. So there's a lot of different critical debates about the nature of Emily Dickinson and Susan Dickinson's relationship. And there's a lot of letters as well, correspondence between the two. And there's like a really nice little extract where I'll kind of read it to you in a minute, but basically there's these private letters that show the kind of intensity of Emily Dickinson's sort of reverence for Susan, or who she calls Sue. So she really loved her, and the type of love she felt and the extent, sort of the different elements of that love are debatable. But it's not debatable that she liked her. She really, really cared a lot about her, and Susan was one of the most important people in Dickinson's life. So there's this sense really that because Susan Dickinson means so much to Emily, that if Susan kind of, leaves her or goes away, because Emily didn't travel and she didn't go anywhere or do anything beyond the confines of her homestead, there's a real sense that basically it's kind of going to feel like loss or abandonment, and there's going to be feelings of kind of fear about that happening, or anxiety when that occurs. And so this poem is kind of about that. It's about the idea of what happens if something you love goes away, something that you really almost feel like you need or you can't live without, and it disappears out of your life. How do you deal with that emotion? How do you deal with the feeling? So it's quite interesting, really, as a poem. It's useful life advice, useful for kind of understanding your own sort of feelings and impulses and emotions. So I always like it when you can connect poetry to your reality, because then you're just like, yeah, there's a poem about this. I kind of do that in my everyday life. I'm just like, oh, a weird situation cropped up. What poem helps me? Or, what would Shakespeare say? I often do that in my head, and it does actually really help you for your life. So I recommend doing it as well. You do come across as a little bit mental to people who don't read poetry, but that's okay. The kind of take-home message from this one is about how to deal with feelings of loss, abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of loss, that type of thing. So, so she said in a letter to Sue, which included this poem at the end of it. So most of her poems as well, they're kind of kept away in her own private little journals, and no one reads them until after she dies, because she did get published a bit in her life, and she did try to be published, but she's so self-critical and kind of quite a unique individual person who thinks and feels very differently from most people around her at the time of writing. So a lot of her poems are deeply private, and it's not clear if anyone ever read them. Whereas this one is deliberately, it has an intended audience of an individual person. So if you want to analyze this poem or write about it in an essay, I really recommend that you read more into the relationship between Susan and Emily Dickinson, because that will give you loads more insight into the motifs and imagery of this one. But with this letter, she says, Sue, you can go or stay. There is but one alternative. We differ often lately, and this must be the last. The letter continues in this bitter vein, but then ends with this poem that to me begins in pain, but ends in a state of spiritual gain. So there's been a lot of conflict and tension between these characters, or these individual people, and Susan is thinking of leaving, perhaps for a different reason, but Emily has a conflict of interest with her. She wants Susan to stay. And she says, we differ often lately, and this must be the last. So she's saying, I don't want to fight with you. A lot of things recently we've got into have been kind of arguments or heated debates where I think very differently to you. And I wrote this poem to try and process how I feel. And then I think if you read the poem in that context, it's such a kind, sort of generous poem, because the sentiment of the poem is trying to be uplifting. It's trying to be kind of understanding of what happens if something really important to you disappears out of your life, and how do you kind of recover from that spiritually. So she says it begins in pain but ends in a state of spiritual gain. That's really crucial, I think, for this one. So yeah, let's have a look at the pain. So yeah, there's basically, I have a bird, and spring is, I own a bird. I have a nice thing that is around me in springtime, which is a moment in the year that is kind of lively, energetic, a moment of growth, a signifier of happiness. And it sings for myself. So there's a sense of selfishness. I have this bird, I keep this bird, and it sings to me, and I like its song. The spring decoys. The spring is a decoy. It's a distraction from the real bloom of life, which is the summer. So maybe she's playing around with, the ages of herself and Sue at this point. The fact that there's the spring of your life, which is a period of kind of growth and experimentation, and then there's the summer where you're kind of fully in bloom, if you think of it that way. It's quite common in literature to use the seasons to kind of map onto the stages of man, or the stages that an individual goes through throughout their life. So as the summer nears and as the rose appears, Robin is gone. So the bird kind of disappears while the rose comes. So something more beautiful or different in its beauty causes the bird to disappear. But I'm not sad, I don't repine, because I know that bird of mine. So again, this possessiveness, there's a lot of possessive pronouns in this poem, so you might want to kind of zoom in on those. Even though that bird has run away, it's flown away, it's going to learn a new song, and when it returns, it's going to have new stories to tell. So there's a sense of, okay, I'll let you go if you come back, but you better come back. So it's not like, entirely like selfless, like, it's fine, just go do what you want in life. It's, I will allow you to go if you do sometime return to me, and we can be together again, and you can tell me your new stories that you learned along the way. So yeah, there's mine and thine as well, which are deliberately kind of opposed throughout the poem. So myself, mine, me, and then thine, which is you. So there's a sense of you versus me, and we're in opposition, and the pronouns are quite separate. There's not, we or our in this case. There's no harmony between the speaker and the subject of the poem. So she has a doubting heart. So she's clear, the speaker in this poem, which we can intimate is Emily herself. She's clear that there's doubt, there's skepticism, there's frustration, there's uncertainty, but at the same time, there's a sense of motivation to not be so possessive and to not be so strict and kind of needy in a way. So sort of how you deal with your kind of needy emotions. And then we have some comparative adjectives: a serener bright, a more golden light. It's almost like to let something that you love go and then return will provide ultimately more joy and happiness than to kind of keep that thing forever sort of locked down with you if that thing has an urge to explore and to go away. So it's exploring kind of the sort of positives and negatives of love, and how those can sometimes be bound up together. So love can be so intense and so great that you have for someone that the idea of them not being around causes severe suffering, and it causes possessiveness as a result of that. But the idea that actually really loving something is a selfless act and you should let it go, and then it's like a cliche, if you love something, let it go. But that's kind of how this poem is really. I don't know if it was a cliche at the time that she wrote this. So she has doubts, fears, discord, there's problems, there's it's not plain sailing, but she's trying to get a handle on that and to manage all of that and not repine, not feel bad, because she knows that there's going to be a bright melody upon the return. So there's a repetition as well of that motif of the melody. Motif. So melody's like a beautiful song. So yeah, it's a kind of extended metaphor for friendships and relationships, if you think of it that way. And yeah, I think it's quite beautiful. It's a conflicted, emotionally conflicted poem, but it's trying to be positive, trying to be motivational. And I think it's a really sweet thing for Emily to send to Sue, because it's sort of like her saying, I know that we had bad arguments. I know that I was being selfish, trying to keep you here. And I'm trying to, um, allow myself to understand that you might disappear for a bit, and when you come back it'll be even better. So she's trying to say sorry, basically, in the poem, which I think is sweet. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of interesting contextual stuff, like I say, about Sue that you might want to go into more with this poem, but I've given you a good kind of angle into it, a good insight. So hopefully you're feeling quite confident on the surface level of the poem and some of the deeper themes and meanings as well. And so yeah, thank you for listening on this one. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you guys soon.